Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Virgil Miller, and I'm a member of the Community-Based Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust here at Sonoma State University. This lecture series is sponsored by Sonoma University's Holocaust Study Center and the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust. Today's topic is resistance by rescuers, how non-Jews help Jews survive and escape. Our panel includes three people. Otto Springer. Mr. Springer is a German. He's an engineer. He was working in Czechoslovakia when the Nazis invaded. He was married to a Jewish woman, so according to the Nuremberg laws, he was in danger. He was in charge of some coal mines, and while an executive in this operation, became involved in some complex and dangerous rescues over an extended period. Finally, was himself put in a concentration camp. Our second guest is Odette Myers. Ms. Myers was born in Paris in 1934. She and her mother managed to evade the roundup of Jews because of a simple concierge in their apartment. She was left with a family and raised as Catholic. Later, when her mother lived in a village, and later with her mother, lived in a village where there was the partisan support. Our third speaker is Dr. John Steiner. I was told you were going to be part of the panel.
I'm a moderator.
I would like for our moderator. Okay, I screwed up on two, now I've screwed up on the third.
That's all right. I mean, at least you are being consistent.
If you were my kid, I'd cut you off right there.
The other way around.
Today's guests.
Before we start, just have some few announcements. Some people have to pick up the papers. Miss Moore, Miss Smith, Chase. All right, are they present by any chance? They'll be here, all right? And then I'd like to remind you, if you can generate your questions which you want to see answered by a panel, because there are still some dark areas, questions you may find you either have not been answered by some of the speakers in the past, and some of the new questions you may have which simply were not covered properly. So we would appreciate if you would down on the paper some of the questions which are burning questions, and then we will try to answer them. The chances are very good. And lastly, I'd like to remind you that there is the interesting exhibit in the library on the second floor exhibit, and it would be kind of nice if you could have a look at it, because you might find it stimulating, if not very pleasant, but at least stimulating and thought-provoking. And you may have some questions in regard to that exhibit as well. Today's panel is very important, particularly since we are talking about two individuals who played very different roles. One who was a rescuer, and the other was a person who was rescued. Mrs. Myers was rescued, and Mr. Springer was a rescuer. to be a rescuer meant to risk one's life. And that is something perhaps which needs to be emphasized, because most of us, that is to say most of you, because I spend time in a number of different countries and of course many concentration camps. In Nazi Germany, anyone who just simply associated with Jews was considered to be an arch criminal, tainted with mischief, and to be put away into concentration camps. People who were called to rescue Jews, chances were that they would not survive it. So they risked their lives. And that is something which is very difficult for us to understand, because the conditions in the Third Reich were so structured that this was not a free society you may have gathered by now, but it was all a total institution, a dictatorship which did not permit you to play roles and act upon alternatives. In other words, you had no chance but to adjust, conform, comply to the rules and regulations which were exceedingly tight. So, for example, we've already mentioned in the past that if you moved from one place to another, you had to register you from one address to another with a police department. This, by the way, is still the case today, and I'm saying in all European countries. So that is to say, the authorities knew exactly about your whereabouts. That is to say, they knew where to find you in case they were looking for you. That was exceedingly difficult, therefore, to escape, because all the Jews were registered, and all the police and the secret state police, the Gestapo, had nothing else to do but go and find out exactly where these people lived, whom they wanted to apprehend. So that is something which most of us don't realize. In a country where people can move from one place to another without informing any authority other than at best your friends, and those you probably don't inform because you may be glad to be rid of them, which may include some relatives as well. So for us to realize that the conditions of Nazi Germany were total. You could not move without the authorities being aware of it. Now, especially since there was a law which prohibited to interact with Jews, Gypsies, and those people who were considered to be the enemies of the Reich. People who did that, in spite of all, as I said before, risked their lives. And if they were apprehended, the chances are they have it. Mr. Otto Spenger is one of those who have risked his life and received numerous recognitions for it. And he will tell us what he did, why he did what he did, and what the possible consequences were, and how he felt while doing it. And that should be exceedingly interesting, because whatever he's going to tell you in his way, in his very stimulating way, you also may later on have questions, which he, I'm sure, will be happy to answer. Now, the recipient of such generous and brave behavior, which we really may define as profiling courage, was Mrs. Oretmeier, Dr. Oretmeier, actually. And her life was saved in France by a group of people who were assuming the role of rescuers. Very frequently, these were Catholics, Catholic nuns or priests who supported people because of their faith, who were persecuted. In France, it was especially ticklish because France is not known for not being anti-Semitic.
That's an understatement.
Which is an understatement, because even when I was in Dachau, I was imprisoned with many French people, and within Dachau, where all people were inmates, fellow inmates, even there you had the French inmates who, instead of lashing out against the perpetrators, against those people who were responsible for their being sent to a concentration camp. They made the life of fellow inmates, Jewish inmates, exceedingly difficult, and I had to deal with that on very many occasions. They discriminated and tyrannized Jewish inmates, although they themselves were sent there by the Nazis. And that's kind of a paradox for us to observe, that in spite of the fact that they all were inmates, they discriminated against each other. So it would be a misunderstanding to assume that people, merely because they in camps, they worked together and developed an esprit de corps. This was unfortunately in most cases not so, and where it was the case, it was an exception to the rule. The rule was indeed that they did not necessarily cooperate with each other, but they fought each other and made therefore survival more difficult for each other. So without spending more time on these explanations, which we can go into later on, I'd like to perhaps ask Mr. Otto Spenger to talk to you about his role as rescuer.
I think I will give you an outline of what has happened during the 10 years, and then we will go into the various stages, because my experience is very complicated. In a stage of my endeavor to help Jews, I got a connection with the British Secret Intelligence Service, and it proved to be very, very helpful to us. They had means which we didn't have, and we helped a lot of people together. And on the other hand, I got involved in this organization because in about 1942, and my Jewish wife realized that there's no way we could survive a victorious Nazi regime. We had to do whatever there was possible to bring that regime down. And the best way was to join the British. And so I was born German and lived in Czechoslovakia. I was a professor of the German University in Prague, and we were a so-called prominent family. During my university studies, I met an architecture student named Hannah Adler and fell in love. Hannah was Jewish and I was German. In the meantime, Hitler came to power in Germany. We were pretty well informed, because Jews from Vienna came to Prague, Jews from Berlin were already there. We had all their experience with the Nazi regime. So we were a little prepared for what would happen. When the Nazi laws, so-called Nuremberg laws, were promulgated in Germany, that was in 1935. We were in Czechoslovakia, so we didn't care too much, depending on what you expected from the future, whether you expected they would overrun Czechoslovakia or not. We were convinced they would not, and were dead wrong. When they occupied Prague, they had leapfrogged us, and now, according to the Nuremberg laws, we were, everybody resulting from a marriage of concluded after the deadline date of the Nuremberg laws was considered to be, for instance, a mixed parentage, Mischlinge. They were under conditions to be treated as full Jews. And this happened to future children. My wife lived in Prague, and we decided in 1938, that was 3 years after the Nuremberg laws went into effect, to get married. And this brought us into a twilight zone, I would say, between the Jews and the Germans. For instance, Dr. Steiner said rightfully that any contact with Jews was criminal, but not to me, because I was married to a Jew. I was already on the wrong side, so I could get into touch with you, so I could go and help Jews, bring some foodstuff or something like that. Yes? Anybody else would have been arrested, but I was allowed to do that. And so we met at 8, and I became a criminal against the race. And my wife...
Race defiler.
Race defiler is a good word.
Race
Rassenschänder is the original word. I had not the right translation. This is much better. So, my wife was... we were living pretty well in Prague, and my wife had to wear, of course, the yellow star. She was not allowed to leave the house after 8 o'clock. She was not allowed to travel even on the trolley without a written permission, and only on the last platform, and so on. The last platform was for dogs and for Jews. And
could not enter shops.
What?
Could not enter shops,
Yeah.
I think.
And could not, only at certain times she could do her shopping. And this was pretty, you know, when somebody had a yellow star, he was the weakest member, so plenty of people treated you badly. And so we lived quietly until 1944. My wife's parents went with a second transport from Prague in October 1941 to what they called a resettlement. We did not know where they were going. The Nazis even kept up the illusion by letting my parents write postcards. Very simple, we are fine and so on, how are you? We were allowed to send food parcels. Of course, only starchy items, no high caloric food or any kind of fat or meat or so. The Jewish rations is well known already at that time, absolute starvation rations, and people had to get slowly worked down. So our advantage was that we had money. We could buy on the black market. And I don't know whether I should talk. I will give you first the frame. So in 1944, it was decreed that I would have to weigh a way to get out of my shameful condition, being married to a subhuman. So they gave me the chance to rescue my German honor, and they sent me a letter whose original I have here. And it reads as follows in translation. You are here, reference is nationality. You are herewith requested to let us know without delay whether you will maintain the marriage with your Jewish spouse Hannah Springer-née Adler, or whether you are willing to divorce same. I did not reply, and then I got a letter that they are revoking my nationality. They didn't talk about the citizenship. The German Volkszugehörigkeit, the nationality was denied to me, and therefore I lost my, as a consequence, I lost my citizenship. And then there came a simple note that I have to be on a certain day at 10 o'clock in the morning at a gathering place with 45 kilograms of luggage. So I was transported to a small camp which was in Silesia, and conditions there were in the beginning pretty nearly normal. But we, for instance, there were millions of bedbugs, and we could not absolutely. The barracks were smoked, yeah, but the bedbugs survived on the outside, climbed in again, and they swamped us again. So we burned our mattresses as an act of protest. And the camp commander, he was very nice, but he said, okay, you burnt them, you don't have them. And we had only such boards and had to sleep on these boards for a couple of months before we got things. So this taught us a lesson. And food, yes, and when we cleaned up the rooms, I found a little scrap of paper. And it was from newsprint, and it was printed in Hebrew. So I knew who were our predecessors, in whose footsteps we had to walk. Because our overall fate had been decided already at the Wannsee conference, you know. That was where Hitler and also Eichmann was there, and Heydrich, of course, but also our Dr. Günther, Obersturmbannführer Dr. Günther, whom I later confronted, and who was our boss.
Günther was, by the way, Eichmann's right-hand person.
Yes. I may have time for this story later on, but Günther, he was also the guiding spirit behind the Jewish Museum. It was interesting. Günther had told nobody when he came to Prague that he had studied Hebrew, spoke perfectly Hebrew, that he had studied Jewish history, and he loved the Jews, but he killed them. It was a love-hate relationship. I heard the word love from employees of his museum. They said he simply loves it. It was a completely perverted mind. And the Jewish Museum, as you may have read, a couple of years ago, there was an exhibit traveling all over the United States. These were the most beautiful pieces from the Jewish Museum. And I must confess, I own 2 of these pieces, which I stole. But I stole them to the Germans. And my wife keeps them in Bayside. So, you must now realize what happened in the meantime. It was already after Stalingrad, after the defeat of the Nazis in Stalingrad, it was already the 1,000 years empire showed all kinds of creaks and...
What year was that?
In 1944, I was sent to the concentration camp in October. And some of the Germans tried to create an alibi so that if things would end differently than they had imagined, they could say, I helped this and this and this Jew. And they did it. And they helped us. And some of them were also simply, it was very difficult to them to show some opposition. And again, when they met a German, they were careful. But when they met a German and knew that he was married to a Jewess, they trusted him. And so I had a completely different perspective from what was going on and where I could get help. And we did that. We were then transported to, when the Russians approached, we were marched 30 miles to the next camp. And there, this was already then in January 1945. At that time, the food was already miserable and we were really starving. And we were marched to the next camp, which was Graditz. And then we were slowly moved in transports in the direction of our hometown Prague, in the general direction. And the destination was an SS boot camp near Benešov, and we were the working detachment for the SS men. But we were the last 40 of us. There was absolutely no space, according even to camp standards, where they were stacked up. We had to sleep on the floor and stay overnight on the tables in the mess hall and so on. And then we were transported, and we learned from our transport commander that this would be the Hagibor camp, which was in a suburb of my hometown, and which was the dream, because we heard already rumors that they are making a model camp, another model camp, the second one was Theresienstadt and one was... Because they expected the visit of the International Red Cross, and they wanted to show off. And I must say, not I myself only, but my wife profited most from the Potemkin structure, we called it. Potemkin was a prime minister of Empress Catherine the Great, and when she traveled to her summer seat in the Crimea, Minister Potemkin had along the way put up cardboard villages which would her, so that she thought there was a prosperous countryside. And so we called everything the Germans built up to deceive, yes, the International Red Cross and then the Danish Red Cross. The Danish Red Cross, by the way, was absolutely deceived. They were in Theresienstadt, and they said how wonderful they live there, and so on and so on and so on. Unbelievable. But we profited from this system. For instance, my first child was born in the Jewish hospital in Prague, which was part of that. And then the Jewish Museum was also part of this. And then the both concentration camps in little camps, Theresienstadt and our camp, and it was really a blessing, but only for a couple of people who had the good luck to get into this system. I didn't do a thing. I was elected speaker of the camp. My title was oldest, Judenältest.
Camp senior.
No,
Camp elder.
Jewish elder.
Elder.
That was my title, although I was not Jewish. And then we got into a camp where women were, and there was die Judenälteste. That means the oldest Jewess. And this was my title then.
Which was not just, for you to not misunderstand, doesn't mean anything in terms of age. It means that you are in charge.
Yes.
Some of them quite young, actually.
And I worked the entire system also because we succeeded in bribing 2 Gestapo men and 1 SD man, and got the help of one of them, a fantastic hero, who, by the way, was then very much honored. He was before a people's court, and it turned out that he was the archivist, in charge of archives of the Gestapo. And it works this way. My friend, Dr. Frank, I gave him, a man has been arrested, and I gave him just the personal data, address, and so on. And he visited with Kaiser night, and Kaiser had the files and could tell us what was the case, who else could expected to be arrested, who was in danger, and so on. And this was a tremendous help. And which Gestapo man is handling that? And 2 of them I had bribed. This would take too long because it was a very complicated process. But we got a large number of Jews, and also Czechs, resistance people and so on, out of the Gestapo. Yeah, they were dismissed by the Gestapo, but didn't help. They were transported anyhow to Auschwitz. And this was heartbreaking. You know, you had these people out already, but we had nowhere to hide them. And this was now a thing which Professor Olliner, in his book, now has established. To run a rescue, a single rescuer needed a supportive network of at least 8, not only physically supportive, but also mentally, you know, to sustain him. And the Nazis made the organization of anything which needed communications impossible. And this was the most abominable thing, that you could not, could you trust this guy or not? Yeah. So it was always a risk that you would run into a Nazi agent. So we were in Hageborg camp till the end on the 5th of May 1945. The Prague uprising erupted, and you know what happened there, he just told me. The fighting in Prague started. There were about 2,000 Czechs and 30,000 Germans killed in this fighting.
Mostly SS troops.
SS.
Military branch of the SS.
Yes, that was the Pückler army, and they were absolutely massacred, of course. And also we are at the topic of resistance by rescuers. Our young boys, mostly communists, then, of course, massacred our guards. And this happened on the 5th of May, and then we thought, oh, that's nice, now we are free, and we'll enjoy our children, and so on, and so on. Nothing of that kind, because I was in a group of agents around my case officer. His name was Harold W. Gibson. And I have here the proof that it was the British. You know, it is difficult to get proof of such things. But since Peter Wright wrote now The Spy Catcher, became a bestseller against the will of Mrs. Thatcher, and he published it in America. And here he writes about the question of Anthony Blunt. Anthony Blunt was a so-called fourth man in the conspiracy of Philby against the British government. They infiltrated the MI6 and the Foreign Office.
These were the communists, by the way, some of you don't.
Of course. They were the so-called Cambridge communists.
Communists,
yes. Ideal communists from the 30s. And they then had a network. I am naming now about 14 names of their victims which have not yet been published. Because the Russians then killed these people, and my friends were among them. So Blunt was a traitor, and Peter Wright questions him. After a few minutes' discomfort, he began to resume his poise. The ice began to settle down. He knew he had nothing to throw. We had nothing to throw at him. "I've already told you, Peter," he muttered. "There was nobody else." I switched back and began to press his conscience. "Have you ever thought about the people who died?" Blunt feigned ignorance. "There were no deaths," he said smoothly. "I never had access to that type of thing." "What about Gibby's spy?" Gibby is Gibson. I flashed, referring to an agent run inside the Kremlin, which is inside the Kremlin to run a spy happened only once at that time. Inside the Kremlin by an MI6 officer named Harold Gibson. Gibby's spy provided MI6 with Politburo documents before the war until he was betrayed by Blunt and subsequently executed. He was my case officer, and here are his letters. And I have many of them. So the Russians, through their agents in MI6 and the Foreign Office, read every single of my cables. And after the war, I had the honor to be questioned personally by Major Bedřichny, Stalin Beria's personal representative in Prague. It is, in the meantime, it appeared in the literature. And he offered me whether I wouldn't. I had quite a good qualification, apparently. And he offered me cooperation with the Communist Secret Service, and I said, look, I am neutral, but after 10 years of this nerve-wracking business, I want to have my peace and quiet. I cannot, yeah? But I became a non-person. That means I couldn't get my citizenship confirmed. I couldn't get my passport, even a permission to emigrate. They forced me into the communist arms by having found, I was at that time at the American embassy in Prague as a clerk. Too long a story to tell you how. But I excuse me, sometimes I must make a pause. Where was I?
You were you were a clerk in the American embassy.
Embassy. And I knew already that what I had was priceless, part of it, which you can see here. So I threw everything, what was confidential or secret or so, I threw into a box in the embassy. And when we finally had to escape in 1948, in September, we escaped successfully, and the box with my documents came out, a diplomatic pouch, and that is how it came to San Anselmo. And there are documents about the Jewish part of things. I showed you already the nationality revocation of my citizenship and how it was done, but here is another interesting document. In July of 1943, my Jewish wife, Hannah, was assigned to forced labor in this typically Jewish document. All these things were done by Jews, who, of course, took a tremendous load of their German shoulders.
Maybe we can listen without this interruption always by the photographer. What is this?
She was assigned to the so-called Jewish kindergarten in Prague. My wife, we had divorced after 30 years of marriage, but are continuing good friends. There were certain things my wife could not talk about at all. And when I was researched by Professor Ollinger and Vogelmann and these people, they all wanted to talk to Hannah, and she refused, simply. It turned out that this job she had was, this kindergarten was run by the Gestapo and for the Gestapo by the Ältestenrat by the Jewish organization. I told you already that I had a very high income, and fortunately my German boss, he was chairman of the board of our company. He sent to my wife, while I was in the concentration camp, my full salary for 8 months. That was the rest of the war. So my wife had the money. She could buy foodstuff for these children. And so she, first thing, she hired a real charwoman to do her work, and then she took over playing with the children, sewing dresses for them and so on. Only after a short period, it turned out that these were the children from marriages where one part had been already executed and the other part was for good in a concentration camp. So after a few weeks, they collected the children and shipped them elsewhere. My wife still had no idea what they were doing and what happened to her parents. We had, in 1942, we had the first reliable report of mass executions. I collected these because I had to telegraph it to London for the MI6, but we were not believed. There came questions back, this could not be so, and so on and so on. abominable. And then Hannah learned that these children were shipped directly into the gas chambers, and some even without the help of gas. The last 2 transports were thrown into the flames alive. So, now I have touched many subjects, and I'm ready. I think you should guide me by questions. Which part of framework interests you most? I would like to say also that my sister-in-law had fled in time with her husband's family to Holland. And I have a wonderful story about that. Another couple of our acquaintance did not catch the mandate of the Nuremberg laws and were surprised while they were still engaged. They did not get married. Now, he was a pure Aryan and was worthy to defend his fatherland, so they sent him to the Navy. And he came to us and said, look, my fiancée, Grete is in shots, as we knew already. But to a model camp, you could still send food parcels. I will be at the front. I cannot send food parcels. Would you send the food parcels for me? No, of course. We did it. And I asked him, by the way, where you will be stationed? And he said, in Amsterdam. And he said, oh, now you have a job. Because the last news from my sister-in-law was a postcard from Amsterdam. Wrote, they are sending us away, we are not going, period. A Jewess in Amsterdam. He found her in the uniform of a German officer, believe it or not. And I can show you a copy of a receipt where my sister-in-law confirms money. He never met her directly. It was named Darochi in Amsterdam. They were Jews but had Aryan papers. And there was a center for many Jewish families, and when food was delivered, they distributed that. And when my friend, his name is Georg Mainks, when he came, he was officer in charge of, well, there's a special name for that, in charge of food purchasing and so on for a battery. And he delivered this food partly to the Jews in Amsterdam. By the way, interesting his further fate. You speak resistance and rescuing. He did the rescue work, but he did also the directive resistance work. He became involved in a mutiny against Dönitz. When Hitler died, Dönitz, Gross Admiral Dönitz, took over.
Great Admiral Dönitz was in charge of the
U-boats.
U-boats and the
Yes.
German Navy too.
And then he became the Ersatzführer, we called him. He became Hitler's successor for a short time. So
After his suicide.
Mainks exhorted the soldiers, especially of Austrian and Czechoslovak origin, to refuse the oath on Dönitz. They had to be sworn in on Dönitz's person. Yes? And he was arrested as the leader of the mutiny and was court-martialed. And during the process, he had a great idea. He said, shouting at the top of his voice, "You have no right to judge me. I'm a Czechoslovak citizen. The Czechoslovak government has returned to Prague, its legal seat, and you have no right to sentence Czechoslovak citizen to death. Now they started debating among each other what this was a new angle. And he said, if you touch me, you will be held responsible as a war criminal. and he pointed to the door because there were battle noises outside. He said, and maybe soon. And in this moment, the Canadians opened the door. But this was not the end of his life, of his advent. First of all, a typical... What? Yes, of course. I just finished this story because
No,
I had 42 years to keep my mouth shut because
Yes.
I was classified as secret by the CIA, and so I could not talk about it. And now when I'm starting to talk, so just shortly, he was visited then by a group of Czech officers, and they confirmed that he was sentenced to death, that he was doing witnesses and so on, and his Czechoslovak citizenship should be returned to him, and so on and so on. But suddenly, the train was diverted, and he was in the Most, in the Uhelnedoli, in the mines of Most. And the officer in charge of this camp took it and said, "You are a traitor. You are a traitor against Hitler, you would be a traitor against us," and tore his papers up. And it took a year to get him out of this camp. A year in 1945. So, I'm finishing.
Well, thanks very much for your rather complex and interesting story, and there'll be quite a number of questions which will follow after Mrs. Meyer, Dr. Myers has given her presentation. Why don't we start and get your story?
I'm so used to complexity on this subject. There is no way to go around it. I talk to children often, and they love rescues. You know, I come there as a rescue, and I used to think that I was bringing them the good news. You know, they were some good people who helped Jews. In their wisdom, and I thought that, you know, this would be of great comfort, they listen, they pay attention, and in very short time, they figure it out, and they say, aha, see, there was somebody who needed rescue, there was a rescue, therefore there was great danger. And they don't get distracted, you know, through all this. They really understand that rescue, any story of rescue means that there is great danger around, and you heard, you know, a lot of that. There were many things that were, you know, close to my heart or my memories and so on, of course. And one of them is, it's complicated, and I think the stories are just coming out for of reasons, but partly because it does not fit the usual, you know, pattern. Usually when if I say I was in hiding, they say, ah, yes, like Anne Frank. And I have to explain, no, not like Anne Frank. I mean, there were many ways. I happened not to be physically confined. But there is this real desire to simplify, if possible, this of all subjects, I think absolutely the most complicated that I've come across. Right, that I understand. And certainly a lot of the other things, I wore the star and all. But just to give you a quick background, I grew up in Paris. My parents were foreigners. They were Jews from Poland, therefore second-class citizens, even in comparison to the French Jews. There was a division in France. The old-timers, French Jews, looked down upon the Jews, especially from the Slavic countries. when we were occupied and when we, on top of it, we had a collaborating government, which everybody doesn't seem to be aware of when I mentioned, but France had a very strong orientation toward fascism also, and when it collaborated, the fascists who almost came into power in February of 34 were in the Vichy government. That means we didn't have people who were that different in many ways from the people in Germany. I think people tend to think of France as the country of, the very civilized country of croissant and all kinds of nice things, but they did really have that orientation, which for us Jews was very dangerous. So we were aware of danger before the war. If you know of the Dreyfus case, you know that it polarized France, and it went on and on and on, and France was really either the French very anti-Semitic for a number of reasons, or else they were, in a sense, in a spirit of resistance, anti-Semitic. Not necessarily pro-Jewish, you understand, but on some kind of ideological grounds, they fought anti-Semitism. And they still do it more on that intellectual level in many cases. Now, so what you have to understand is, when we were occupied, we had a collaborating government with many fascist anti-Semites in that government. The anti-Jewish measures had already been taken little by little, as in Germany, but later. That is, Jews could not, there were signs, the parks and all the public places, movie theaters and so on, and forbidden to dogs and Jews. Yeah. And we had also restrictions on shopping orders, all these kinds of things happen as in Germany. The virulence of the French anti-Semitism took on a dimension that not everyone is aware of, but I will tell you about it. In 1942 was with the enactment of in July, the enactment of the final solution in France. And it was a surprise raid. They had several attempts at rounding up all the Jews, but the Jews, many of whom were in the resistance, had gotten word of it, and people managed to get away. However, they organized a foolproof secret roundup that took place in July. And what we didn't know until later, of course, and what really did shock everyone at that point, is they took children. Now, before that, they would say, you took adult men and women or young people and send them to work, somewhere. But what kind of work is a 2-year-old going to do, really? And that was very disturbing, and it happened that I read later. There's a documentation that if people want to see, it's a rare book in translation, but it's called Betrayer alt Veldiv, and it explains the machinery, the kind of scientific approach with which they managed to trap the Jews of France. The Gestapo, together with the French police, very cooperative French police. At that point, Eichmann was not sending, they kept wanting to keep the illusion, so the children were not taken. That's one. And two, what do you do with children in a camp? At that point, it wasn't clear. It was the French chargé d'affaires for the Vichy government who convinced Eichmann that if you're going to get the work done and get rid of Jews, you must kill the children, period. You must take everyone, including the children, otherwise it's not logical. And there was some hesitation, but in case Eichmann was brought to Paris and wine and dine and convinced. So that this was an extremely traumatic experience, that the children be taken. Also the very old, the dying, anyone. They took anyone. Now the way it happened is that it came about very early in the morning, and they came with trucks and nobody knew. About 5 o'clock at dawn, something very early. And my mother and I were in an apartment on the first floor. My father was a prisoner of war, and we had a concierge who was like the manager of the building, who was a wonderful woman. I will tell you more about her. And she did something that was very much spirit, if you want, of resistance of a certain kind. How she knew, she was very protective, so she ran up at one point and said, they're coming for you, come down. She put us in a closet. And then they came, and they were French police, There have been a German with them. I think that there was a German with them. We didn't see, we heard. We could hear the whole conversation. What did she do? She welcomed them with open hands and said, how wonderful, because they said, we came to get your Jews. And she said, how wonderful. I'm so glad you're doing this job. And she carried on and on, please come in and this and that. She said, I'm so sorry, my Jews aren't here today. Jews pretend to be poor. This was a very working class neighborhood. But, we all know they have money and they're better off than we are. And they have a country house and they got away and they're living well in the country while, I have to stay in Paris and so on. And she carried on like that, and she said all kinds of anti-Semitic things. They were little, they had moments. The first thing she did also was offer them her best wine. In any case, she did manage to keep them going and pretended to be Alsatian, although she was from Lorraine, because there were many sympathizers to Germans in Alsace. And at a certain point, they said, and this is what, and talking about the danger, they said, lady, suddenly one of them caught himself and said, lady, if you're not telling the truth, we'll go and search, we'll check. If you're not telling, you will suffer the same fate as Jews if you try to harbor them. And they wanted to go upstairs to our apartment where it was obvious that we were not far. We had just been, the bed wasn't made and so on. And so she went again on all kinds of anti-Semitic things. She really knew it, too. I remember being astonished. I was 7, this wonderful, wonderful woman, but somewhere along there was absolutely knowledgeable in all the anti-Semitic comments one could make, or any French person could make. And she said, Jews, they're so messy, and so on and so on, and the French are so clean and neat, so as the Germans, and you don't want to go to that apartment. When I have to go there, I have to hold my nose, at the door. I don't want to go. Somehow or other, she distracted them. They didn't go. She kept at it and kept offering them all kinds of things. Finally, they left. Well, by the time they left, they were in a course, like, in cities like Paris or the old European cities, so that actually in our block, no Jew was taken. It was time enough that she not only did she save us, but at the same time, by keeping them a longer time, other people managed to find hiding places. That she did. in that manner. Then my mother, incidentally, who had been in the resistance all along, was able to do her resistance work because this woman babysat me, took care of me while my mother was at meetings, or if she couldn't come back because it was too dangerous, sometimes for a day or two, she took care of me. So she, in a way, allowed my mother to do resistance work. After this event, we had many people in our family who were taken and never came back. And all the children, incidentally, who were taken, not one came back of these children. Yeah? Neighbors, all kinds of people I knew. Afterwards, I was sent to the country. Now, it's always so difficult to follow three stories, but I will tell you simply. I was sent to the country first with a family. 8 months later, I was with my mother. Now, just to follow the first rescuer's story, the others are much shorter. I want you to know what else such a person could do. And she herself was almost illiterate. She had she was born to an unwed mother in a little village. She had not had any education. And sometimes I think that it helped myself because naturally she was an extremely intelligent person and she thought for herself. And I really think that's a very important ingredient of all rescuers, whatever their level of education or I think, one, they had to be very intelligent. Two, they had to think for themselves. And then, of course, they had to have certain moral values. But those two ingredients sometimes we forget. We think only of the courage and the nobility of character. I really think it took that kind of, those other elements. So when she continued to protect my mother, of course, and then I was somewhere else. Then my mother joined me. What we found out later when we came back to Paris was the number of people whom she helped in various ways. And she was a woman who, in her peasant-like way, also only trusted the people she knew. So she knew my mother, but also got to know all the people that in the resistance that my mother was working with, because they came there, they had code words, and she knew them. And she was like a communication headquarters for all the people in the resistance and the Jews who happened to know my family. Since my parents were both politically active, that did mean a lot of people. She would not, and that's an interesting point, I don't think that she would have helped someone she didn't know, partly out of her own, suspicion, partly to protect us and the people she knew. There was that problem that Mr. Springer talked about. How do you trust people? So she had out her system, and those people she trusted, she would help immensely. She sent packages to people who were helping. She used our empty apartment as refuge at her discretion. My father was a prisoner of war. She managed to also make herself his godmother, officially somehow or other, and have certain rights to send, communications. In '85, one of my old neighbors who told me, she was nicknamed Madame Marie, everyone called her, "You're Madame Marie, do you know what I had to do?" This was a Gentile woman, a little younger than I. And she told me that what Madame Marie had done is that she knew a wet nurse in the country, and she had sent, who would have a few children as boarders. And she, personally, Madame Marie, had sent some Jewish children in hiding at that woman's house, and she needed a Gentile, who was clearly Gentile child, to be a cover. And so this neighbor of mine was the cover, she said, and she showed me a picture, and she had to accompany the woman of the house shopping, so that they would see, yes, there's a house and there are children, but that they wouldn't get too close a look to the other children who were mostly Jews. So she found any number of ways, maybe probably more than we know. And this was through personal contacts that we found that out. She did that. She had the support of her husband, and not the support of her husband's children, as it happened, one of whom was collaborating. There were collaborators everywhere, too. They were so to us, we had a collaborator. So you think of the danger that a rescuer puts himself in, in situations like that, every which way. And then there were people ready to denounce Jews and to denounce rescuers, for any number of reasons. Nevertheless, she just went through the whole war, with a big smile, and just carrying on. She's the stereotype of a concierge, a good peasant woman, and she kept up this appearance, and in the meantime did all the work that she did, work of rescue and refuge. And this, I think, happened because, one, she was attached to me and my family, and out of this love, out of this attachment, she didn't want us to be touched, she didn't want us to be killed, and this thing, that her original motivation in this case was through love, through this sense of protectiveness, and then she realized other people needed help, and she helped them. There was one rescuer. The others I will talk about very rapidly. My mother, being in the Jewish resistance, one of the things that her group did was to try to find addresses, an address place, that a contact, a lead as to where you could send someone into hiding. She did have an address, and we were sent to that place. It was in the country, in a very, very backward part of France, very, very anti-Semitic. And it is the most backward part of France. Backward in many ways, was very backward technologically, but it was also the part of France called Vendée, which was in those days 80% royalist. Mind you, royalist. They have not yet accepted the French Revolution. By now, they are, in 85, I went back for the first time, and they are now only 60% royalists. So there's progress. Together with it, they really, it's the last, the last stand of the French monarchy was there, and they never got over it. But with it was the idea of the alliance between the church and the monarchy and the aristocracy, the old alliance. And they felt that the Vichy government might help bring this back. So they were pro-Vichy, they were pro-German. The place was full of German soldiers who were sent there after a battle, to recuperate, to eat well. And it was totally friendly territory, and the place was full of Germans. One place, this woman took us in, and the explanation that I have for that is she did it out of love for her father. She was also illegitimate, and her father, who was a baron, was a liberal man. He lived there, and he, out of intellectual beliefs, believed that it was wrong to persecute Jews. And he had asked her, apparently, to agree to take Jewish children and save them and hide them. And she did it very honorably. And she sent us to nun school and treated us as part of the family. We were 4 Jewish girls from ages 2 to 8. I stayed months, and then it became dangerous for my mother to remain in Paris illegally and in the resistance. And she came to join me. We went to another village. We went to, I'll skip all the complications, but it was a relation of this woman. Problem was that we weren't careful about our identities. I had one story in one village and another in another, and the villagers got suspicious. The villagers got suspicious. Now the point is, I regret to say that I do not have one good thing to say personally of my experience with nuns and priests. That they were, I know that some of them were helpful somewhere, but in that area, they were so anti-Semitic that they brought out the classical, old, medieval anti-Semitism. That is, that Jews were, and I heard it from the pulpit, Jews were two things. They were the instruments of Satan. Satan used Jews to distract the Christian from the right path. Two, they were not only the killers of Christ, which was just one of their acts, but as a consequence or as a ramification, they brought death. They just literally brought death wherever they went. So that, for instance, the priest said from the pulpit, if that Jew is very dangerous. Jews are hard. It's hard to tell a Jew from a non-Jew, and some of them are hiding, you know. And how do you tell a Jew from a non-Jew? So he said, you can tell. This is how you tell. If a Jew so much as crosses the threshold of your house, even if you don't know that he's Jewish, someone in your family will die. And then you will know that this person is Jewish. It's that simple. And it happened, we were living at the time in a village of 10 families, little village. Our landlord had, when we arrived there, we rented a house from someone. Our landlord had a son who was about 16 who had been bedridden with TB, I think, was still TB in those days. And one day, the day of his death, all the children came they really wanted to drown me. I managed to get away. They just beat me up badly. Came back to the house. My mother had been evicted. We had been denounced to the Germans, and we were on our way to the end. So, at this point, my mother got hold of this baron, who knew to be a liberal man, but again, because no one knows, we didn't know. She had moments where she wondered, was he or was he not maybe in the resistance, but it was too dangerous to pursue the matter. But she did go to him for help, and he did know, he knew that we were Jewish because he had somehow or other, we had had the contact before, but my mother, he was an indirect contact. We did not know for sure that he was in the resistance, but nevertheless, he was the one person who could perhaps help. My mother went to him. He came to the villagers, and with all the authority of his aristocratic standing, that is, as a baron, he had the highest standing in that area. I don't know myself, one aristocrat from another, but he was a baron. He really was. So I don't know, who's more important, but he was the top man there. And he said, and he had made himself the mayor of the little burg that served 8 villages, and he said, these people are not Jews. I know, I have papers in the office, in the mayor's office. And they stopped. It was an uneasy peace. We don't know if for sure they believed him, but they were going to act as if he did because he made the law. He was the mayor and he was the most prestigious person. And that was that. So we were saved another time. At the end of our stay in that village, incidentally, when it was after the liberation and the Germans were retreating, and they acted very differently when they retreated. They acted like lost children all of a sudden. But the German officer in charge of whatever group was there wanted to shake the hand of the mayor because all was over and well, and the mayor, in the tradition of that village, if you don't, you put out your hand, and if the other person does not want to accept the friendship, despair. So this Baron did that. It was perfectly in the tradition of the village, and he did that. And as they went out, the Germans burned his manor. There was a fire. They burned his manor in revenge of his act of pride that he wasn't about to shake. He didn't think that it had all been a simple little fight or a simple matter, and he didn't feel like shaking the hand of the. And so those were the three people, as examples of three individuals who really acted as individuals for various reasons, and because of them I am here.
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. I think it might be time for us to ask if you have any questions, to whom you would like to direct these questions.
Yes, the question, Dr.
Myers?
You were a little girl when that was happening. I just wondered, before I ask the question, how old were you at the end?
10.
10. Okay, as a little girl, as a Jewish little girl, did you have a feeling, did all this that happened to you give you a feeling that you really were inferior? I mean, what was your inner, do you remember what your inner feelings were about all this that was happening to you?
Yes, yes, in many ways. One, wearing the star, I remember feeling that I was like a moving target. You did feel like, and when they were Germans in Paris, I wore the star in Paris. I didn't wear it when I was in hiding. Yes, I think that on one hand, I was really extremely sustained by the love of this and the protection of this Madame Marie, my first rescuer. I think that, aside from my parents, whom I could count, of course, they were my parents, but that there was someone outside of the Jewish people who was that sure, that convicted, and that, devoted to feeling that I did not belong to an inferior people, not to her, not for a second. That I think that sustained me through some of the worst. And the other woman also did treat us with great respect, and did treat us well. But on the other hand, I really did suffer a great deal from my Catholic education as a secret Jew, and hearing all the anti-Semitic remarks of the nuns and the priests who were the people in authority, never mind, the children I played with or the villagers. That was very, very hard, as a child. The people in authority whom, in some ways, yes, I respected and, felt that way about my people. That was extremely painful. And I think it took a long time to get over that.
See, the interesting thing is that there's a tremendous contradiction between all this religious, in this case Catholic, anti-Semitism, when we stop and think for a moment that Jesus and all the disciples were Jews. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense at all, does it? And yet, it is so easily accepted without question. It's absurd. It's really the absurdity. That's what we call the sociology of the absurd, particularly in regard to ideologies. Just doesn't make any sense, and yet people are prepared to parody it, embrace it, and practice it. Just doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
I have a question regarding the persistence. I can understand people doing one or two good acts, but as Madame Marie and as you, Mr. Springer, did things over and over, What makes people, in your opinion, or I imagine that you've looked at this quite a bit over the years trying to figure out why this happens, but what makes people persist? Because with every act, you up the odds of getting found out. You up your own personal tension, the stress in your family, the odds of your family being brought in. What do you think accounts for the persistence of continuing to be a rescuer, of continuing to seek out ways to make things better, to help people?
Do you want to?
Well, I must say, when they carted away my parents-in-law, I got mad, simply mad. And it was not rational what I did. I somehow had to do it, and then there came, of course, many scenes which somehow commanded my compassion. And I got deeper into that, and simply, it was, maybe it was not logical at all, but that's why I said I got mad.
It's not only being mad, but also the notion, humanity was the priority, to be humane. The notion of being a human being and behaving humanely to others took over. That was the precedent, that was the priority. It's not just being mad, it's just the unwillingness to accept something which was inhuman. And these people prevailed, their humanity prevailed.
Yeah, I think also, excuse me, one other things on that. I heard recently a story about a German woman rescuer who was interviewed, and they said, why did you do it, and so on, what made you do it? And they were talking about courage and heroism and all kinds of things. And she says, no, I'll tell you why I do it. She really got annoyed at all these abstractions. And she said, I didn't do it for anybody else. I did it out of self-respect. And I think that's a really thing, because then self-respect implies what, the definition you give of what it is to be a human being. And then you're, keeping to that stand. I always felt that rescuers had a strong sense of self and of self-respect. Yeah.
I have a question to Mr. Springer. Your wife saved. Was she saved because she was married to a non-Jew?
Yes, but this lasted only to the moment when the Germans entered our country, because she was declared to be a Geltungsjude, that is a full Jew.
Yes.
No protection at all.
So
From that moment
what saved?
Well, she was living illegally, I would say. And I must say one thing.
Could you explain that living illegally? What?
Yes. First of all, you said, you explained the police registration system, which, by the way, is very important for fighting crimes. The high criminality could be licked by a system of police registration, because it's so difficult to live illegally that people would think it over. But my wife was supposed to be legal. For instance, Gestapo men who questioned me, they knew that my wife is Jewish, and they thought that she was protected, because nobody asked me, what was the date of your marriage? I didn't broadcast it, of course. And so they thought that my wife is protected, but actually she was not.
In answer to the young lady's question up there, I'd like to recommend 2 books. The Moses of Rovno, the story of Herman Gravy, that was written by Dr. Reverend
Haneke.
Yeah. And The Last Jews in Berlin.
Oh, that I would like
Yeah.
to have. I read about it.
Particularly the Countess Maria von Malzen. They talk about her a lot and her rescue work. Both these books you'll find in the Central Library.
Yeah. Also, could I recommend a film called Weapons of the Spirit? Have you seen that? That's about the Protestant village, a Protestant village in France where 5,000 inhabitants saved 5,000 Jews. You must have heard, there is a book by Philip Haley, Less Blood Be Shed, something.
The film was at the Mill Valley Film Festival.
Yeah, it goes with the Jewish Film Festival. That is a wonderful film.
Were you able to see Madame Marie after the war?
Not her. Her husband was still alive. She died before I could get back to her, although I did manage to see her husband. That's one of my great grief. She was, I saw her after the war, after the war, but then I came to America in 1949, and then I didn't get back on time to see her alive. But yes, what a wonderful person. It's just, and these kind of people, she didn't talk about it. She just moved on to the next thing, whatever her next thing was, which was basically, being around, being very sociable, being involved in everybody's stories and being helpful. She was, she did have that nature. If a war wasn't on, she was just helpful in personal matters or whatever.
How can you remember all the details of it?
I'm sure that there are things that I don't remember, but when you go through something that is so important that you know that your life is at stake, you tend to remember. People remember the traumatic events in their life. When I was wondering whether or not, I would be taken, that moment I remembered. It may be that I don't remember what happened the month before, things like that. But the really important moments I do remember. Also, because of the atmosphere, because my father was far away for the entire war, so your memory gets sharpened. I had to think of him. Then I was separated from my mother. Then I was given other identity. So I had to forget one identity, bury one identity as a Jew, and then pass as a Catholic, one identity. Then I went to another place and I had to have another identity. And I think it sharpens you. You have to pay attention to details to keep the whole thing in correct order.
Split personality.
I have a question for both of you from different perspectives. Do you have any feel at all, numbers of people who were involved in rescue operations, among those who did it as a result of circumstance, maybe found themselves in a position where somebody came to them and asked for help, as opposed to those who went out of their way to help people? Do you have any feel for the...
Does Olaina study?
The question is to what extent do we know people help without being asked for help out of their own volition rather than responding to to requests for help. And I'm sure that Professor Olaina of Humboldt State may have some answers to that. I personally don't.
Yeah. Professor Olaina's book is printed already, but it has not yet ready. He tipped me for 7 hours. And so I know him very well, and he is asking questions, and I ask him questions, because of the motivation. It is a very good question. For instance, I told him I don't belong here because I did not make a moral resolve to help Jews. I could not, since I had married this Jewess, yes, if I would have agreed to divorce her, it would have been an active act of murder, yes? other people who did not marry, who simply walked away. Plenty of them walked away, yes? They did not have a deliberate act of murder. I was pushed by circumstances into this role, and I couldn't help it. I know, I have studied this question, of course, and I can give you stories where people had simply no other motivation but to combat evil and to do good, yes? An engineer named Kari Meyer, I mentioned his name at my Hashoah speech last year, among 10 other people. Unfortunately, in the meantime, 3 of them died. Kari Meyer was with me in the camp. He was a German chemical engineer, highly educated, and when the Germans marched in, they forced us to register. And since we were already registered in the census of 1930 as being German, we couldn't deny it, yes? But he simply said, I am not a German anymore. He renounced his nationality and became a Czech. And then it happened that friends from Vienna came, a couple and 2 daughters, 10 and 12, in the year 1940. So Emmy Geiringer lost her husband. He was somehow grabbed by the Gestapo and killed. That happened. So she lived in Prague, and I, for the British intelligence, I tried always to get information, and I knew that on a certain date the Nuremberg laws would be applied to Czechs. So far they were not. Yeah, Czechs were theoretically capable, still able to marry a Jew, and so I invited a couple of friends when I had the news confidentially that in 2 weeks the Czechs would have to obey the Nuremberg laws. And Kari said, so I am allowed to marry a Jewess? Where is she? And Emmy Geiringer was there. So he married her, and then something happened. The Gestapo came into Kari's house, and only one of her daughters was at home, and she was at home, and they arrested them, and it turned out it was just mistaken identity. In case of mistaken identity, they tried to arrest her cousin and took her, but she was already trapped and was ready. Kari took the remaining child and hid her in the country, cared for her and so on. It was a child which he had not known 2 months before, yes, an unknown child. And then we got the news that we would have the possibility to get a divorce from our Jewish wives. And we were a couple of mixed marriages and said, of course, there's no question. But Kari, you cannot help your wife at all by not divorcing her. She is already in Auschwitz, yes? So it is idiotic that you go now into a concentration camp because there's no effect at all. So he said, this is impossible because there is the other child, and the Germans are a stickler for organization and so on. They might find in the files that another child must have been there, and they might find it. So I will not bother my conscience with that child. And he went. He was a volunteer to the concentration camp.
May I say something? I think you are not giving yourself enough credit. You are saying you were forced into the situation and you had no choice. That's not so. You had the choice to divorce your wife,
Of course,
and
but-
save yourself like hundreds of others did.
No,
So you
no,
had the choice,
surprisingly
and you
not.
chose the
I
right
don't know.
thing.
I knew a couple of where they both agreed, yeah, in the case of bishops, yes. They wanted to save the fortune, so they got divorced and transferred the money to the wife, and that's what very good friends did, but it ended lethally for the Jewish part, and that was it. But I could not have so easily divorced my wife because her future was sealed.
I know. That's
So
what
I
I mean.
had to commit murder.
That's what I mean. So
Kari,
you were not going
Kari
to do it.
did it without being forced by circumstances.
Okay, last question or two more.
Okay, I just have to ask you, Dr. Steiner, I mean, you've been here this whole time. Are we ever going to hear your story?
Well, hopefully so that we'll have some time. I'll fit it in somehow.
And
We'll
it
fit
is
in.
complicated.
I'll fit it in somehow, yeah.
Did the nuns ever suspect that they had Jewish children? I mean, these were strange children in their school.
No,
If
there
they
was a
suspect-
storyline given. When we arrived at this woman's house, four girls, right? Two were 7 and one was 8. We came in the house. It was a family, grandparents, children, a family, a small house with a yard. She came and she showed us. She was cooking a very fine meal. And then she showed us in the backyard there were pigeons, and then she took us in a room and closed the room and said, "Now, you will be able to eat the meal and play with the pigeons after you know your story. You don't leave the room until you know your story, and you can recite. You can do the sign of the cross and recite the Pater Noster and the Ave Maria." And we stayed there until we knew. She was very patient. She went over it, and then she told us, "I will send, except for the youngest one, I will send the oldest 3 to school, to the nun school, and I will tell the Mother Superior that you are children, Catholic children from Paris. Your mother's fathers are soldiers, the mother having a hard time, and they just want the children to be in the country and get good food and so on. But since you don't know anything, now you have to pass as Catholic, you have to be Catholic, you have to never say that you are Jewish. So I'm going to tell the Mother Superior that you were traumatized in a bombardment." I think was the story. And then she said, "and not to expect much of you for 2 weeks." She said, "Well, during those 2 weeks, don't say anything, just listen, but listen well and learn everything. And every day when you come home, you can ask me questions if there's something you didn't understand. But at the end of 2 weeks, you are expected to be like the other girls and know everything you need to know." So we were, 2 were 7 and 1 was 8 at that point. The little one, she educated herself. And so we went through all this, and then we finally got to the meal. It seemed endless. I don't know how long she kept us there, but, it was like this joke. There's some Jewish joke about having 3 days, to learn to live underwater or something. But we had, 2 weeks to be, absolute Catholics. No, God forbid, if the nuns had suspected us, they would have turned us. The other thing that this woman did that was an act of courage too, in her way, is that nevertheless she was very Catholic, and so she confessed to a priest, right? And thank God it wasn't the priest who really gave us trouble in another village. He wasn't so bad, but what he apparently wanted was, all right, when will you have them baptized? He was ready to go along with it, but he wanted them baptized. So she said, I have to check with the mothers. She checked with the mothers. The mothers said, like all Jewish mothers in these situations, said, prefer not to, but if it gets to be a matter of survival, matter for death, really, okay. But try to stall if you can. And apparently this good woman did stall. And she just kept saying, oh, they don't have the papers, or I can't seem to get hold of them, or they keep forgetting, or she did some number whereby she did stall and we did not get to be baptized. But I always wondered about that. And I did see this woman, talking about in 85, in the summer of 85, I had not had with her at all. One of the tragic things about this situation of Jewish children who were sheltered by Christians is after the war, when we returned to our Jewish communities that were decimated, the children were so important, the Jewish children. 1.5 million had been killed, so we were the lucky ones, we were the future, we were very important, that they feared our contact with the Christians, with our Christian host. And I just did a research paper on that subject, and many of us did not our rescuers again until our adult years. And what I discovered, I came there and I knocked at the door. I thought that she was dead, long dead, but I just wanted to see the house, and I saw her come, and I said, oh, I come from from California, and I was here during the war. I thought, as I was saying, I'm going to scare this poor old lady. She's had no contact since 1945, 40 years. And she just opened the door. She said, Odette. Odette. She called me by my name, and she immediately showed me everything in the house that had changed, as if nothing had happened. And we were 7 hours, we couldn't get out of conversation. It was really bliss. And she had the photographs of us nearby. So if you can imagine, I think that's the other dimension of the rescuers of children suffered. If the children left afterwards and returned to the Jewish community and didn't contact them for a long time, they knew in their heart that's what they saved them for, and they didn't insist and they didn't pursue it. But in their heart it was a loss. And I realized that, because then she said, this woman, I had 2 sons, and my sons had sons, but during the war, I had 4 little girls. And she had all the pictures to prove it, and she was in her glory. And it happened that she had been in and out of the hospital. I was very glad to, and in December, I got one of those black border thing, and the children wrote that, it's very devout Catholic, they said, that she said that God waited for her to have my visit. So, that's the side of it that I've become aware of more recently. My Madame Marie was back in Paris. I did see her as a natural kind of a way, but not this woman, for instance. And I hear that. And I think, especially those who had babies, they were taken care of.
There's one thing which I may just to add a little bit. There's a difference between the racial and religious anti-Semitism. The religious one means if you back down, everything is forgiven. The racial ones didn't forgive anything. Once you were born a Jew, you were a Jew regardless how you turned and twisted around. You were permanent. And that is the difference, because it was unforgiving, totally unforgiving. The racial anti-Semitism means that there's nothing you can, that's a sentence, death sentence.
Yeah, I was just curious about both of your feeling toward it now. I see you have a Jewish star on, but...
Yeah, incidentally, when I wore the yellow star, I remember at one point, talking about feeling inferior, at one point I was approached by drunken German soldiers, and I thought that was the end. Wasn't my end. They did, pull an old woman by the hair in the gutter after me. They laughed at me. I was a child. I don't know what happened. But I remember at that moment, I said, if I get out of this, I will wear a gold star. But this is not gold, this is silver, but I felt that I wanted to turn that.
With some luck, you might still.
Yeah, I'll take a gold, I'll accept a gold.
Would you like to respond to that question? Yeah.
My own?
Yeah.
I was educated as Lutheran and developed then Goethe, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, described it. He said, I am, as a moral being, am a theist, a monotheist. As an artist, I am a pantheist, and as a human being, I am as an artist, I am a polytheist, and as a human being, I am a pantheist. So it is pretty complicated.
What are you now?
All that.
All that. So you turn into a Goethe. Not bad. Thank you very much.
Dr. Steiner, could you describe some of the next lectures? There's 3 of them are very wide open. Reviews, films, discussions. Could you give us an idea of what to expect? Is that something you could do if you want to